Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Augmenting Clinician Insights with Machine Learning Meetup. We're excited to be here. I guess are we really excited to be virtual? We wish we were in Orlando having this discussion in person with all of you in the live virtual audience. So, but we make the best we can with the situations that we have, and I'm excited for this discussion. And I'm excited for this group of panelists to be able to share these ideas, and definitely thank you all of you for attending this live virtual meetup as well. And also to our host, Dell Technologies, thank you for putting this together and bringing all of us together. Just a few housekeeping items. This recording will be available after the event, so we'll send you all of those details if you want to be able to check out the recording, or if you have to slip away because there's a coronavirus outbreak or something in your organization. Hopefully not, but Rasu, you're not allowed to slip away though. No, no, I imagine if you needed to, you could. But hopefully we don't have any of those issues. Thank you everyone for joining. Also, we'll be live tweeting this. Both the Dell Technologies team and the Healthcare IT Today team will be live tweeting this using the hashtag TransformHIT and also the hashtag HITSM. And I imagine many will throw in HIMS20, which is still alive at least this week. People will be sharing everything in our virtual HIMS environment. So thanks everyone for live tweeting. You can engage there. Also, if you have any questions that you want us to incorporate, we'll do our best to incorporate them. Obviously, we only have 45 minutes, but if you have any questions and you're watching live, feel free to throw them in the GoToWebinar question panel as well. Okay, I think that's enough housekeeping. So let's talk about augmenting clinician insights with machine learning. And just for setting the standard here, I think we should, at least for this discussion, use a pretty broad definition of machine learning that could include things like AI and maybe even advanced analytics or predictive analytics. So I think we can, and I think most, maybe marketing ruined that term, AI and machine learning. So at least for this discussion, let's, we can be pretty broad, I think, in our definition. So if you're saying that's not really AI and you're watching, then that's why, I think we're fine to do it. And maybe at times we may differentiate. But generally, we can talk about machine learning, AI, advanced analytics, and kind of this broad spectrum. But, as we dive into this, let's start off with this, and maybe, Ed, you can start us off. We've been hearing about AI and machine learning forever. I mean, I remember in high school going to the college and hearing about this. It's like, but why is now different? Like, what's changed that this really is an important conversation?
Yeah, thanks for asking the question. And just as a quick hello to everybody from Dell Technologies. Thanks again for everyone for showing up, and apologize that we don't have an opportunity to convene face-to-face. But nevertheless, look forward to this format to help try to convey some thoughts relative to AI and machine learning. So yeah, as a person that's been involved in analytics for the last 20 years, it is an interesting thing that we have leveraged analytics around data for quite a while. And in other industries, I would say that if you want to define artificial intelligence, machine learning, and even deep learning, I think it's kind of an important construct to start with. So artificial intelligence is really, I think, kind of the overarching umbrella for a subset of advanced analytics. And that consists of both machine learning and deep learning. So machine learning, I think, is kind of at the core, and that's really basically allowing computer and technology to take data, run algorithms against it, and to come up with some sort of model. Deep learning is really a unique subset of machine learning where it simulates the neural networks of the brain to take fragmented bits of data and algorithms to simulate taking kind of a partial picture and then coming up with a predictive model for what that picture looks like. And then that kind of bubbles up to artificial intelligence, which is really actually automating the insights derived from that machine learning or deep learning algorithm. And I think in other industries, like the automotive industry, we actually do see it today where artificial intelligence is front and center. And if you've got a vehicle today that can drive itself, that's a perfect example of AI in action. But most of us would not go to a physician or see a specialist and be diagnosed with something and then have the surgery performed automatically, right? We would still have some sort of human intervention as a part of our care management. And so I think while today, the here and now is we're pretty mature around machine learning and deep learning, but I think artificial intelligence is still kind of a ways off in terms of being able to take those insights and then apply them in an automated way that impacts our kind of healthcare experience. I will say that that's true on the clinician side. Now, on the research side and on the operational side and financial end of the healthcare spectrum, certainly we can look at and surmise what the data is telling us, and then based on where we're at with a confidence of what that model has predicted for us, we can go ahead and automate actionable results from that. So, for example, if we know that there is a patient population that's at higher risk for a readmission, for example, we might say that, okay, we're going to automate that they not be discharged in the next 6 hours, but wait another 12 hours. So we might automate some of that clinical decision support, or we might, go to a second drug if the first drug isn't available, and do that in an automated way. But in terms of actually performing clinical procedures, still kind of not there. But obviously, advanced analytics is something that I think over the legacy of healthcare is going to certainly be enhanced by what AI, machine learning, and deep learning can do for us.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe Corinne, you want to chime in? Where are you seeing this type of stuff happening within healthcare, and what's changed to make that possible? That for why didn't we do this a decade ago?
Absolutely. It's a question of scale in my mind, that we have tremendous computing capacity now available to us in the cloud. We have on-demand compute, we have elastic compute, and I think that in the past, we might not have had the on-premises hardware necessary to support some of the workflow augmentation that we would like to have offered. I think too, and I always speak about the virtues of what we're getting from the consumer world, a lot of our best technologies, a lot of what we're learning in the world of machine learning is coming out of consumer right now. So what you're seeing happening in advertising, in path planning, in getting food to your door in the fastest way possible, we're waiting for some of those technologies to mature, and then we're able to take sort of the best and the greatest of that, natural language processing technologies, all of that is happening in worlds outside of healthcare. We're not the primary driver of a lot of those techniques. However, once they reach a certain maturity, a certain point that we feel they're stable and understandable, I think we're then able to benefit by bringing them into the healthcare space. Like Ed, I'm pretty averse to using the phrase AI. I think that it's used a lot in marketing concepts. I think too, it recommends a level of autonomy that we simply haven't adopted yet in the healthcare world. I don't see a lot of workflows where machine learning is doing everything without some human intervention. So I see it as an additional tool in the tool set of a clinician or of an administrator in the healthcare delivery process used for decision making. So the title of clinical decision support is quite apt here. I come from the utilization and cost perspective. So I don't, sit at the bedside, I sit at the desk side. So just like you might make use of pharmacopoeia, you might make use of case studies and other research using mesh. Instead, you now have a tool, almost like a digital assistant, that's gone out and said, here's what I've pulled out of a record. Here's what I've aggregated out of a population that you can use as part of your decision-making process. That's why I feel we're in this nice, pivot point of technology is where it needs to be, ability to scale is where it needs to be, and I think people are comfortable and conversant in a lot of these techniques now.
That's great, Corinne. And I would add one other thing. I think you're right. The CPU power, the technology, but also the data is available to be able to do those type of models. So I would add that other element as well. Rasu, what would you add, and where are you seeing it? I think it was interesting how she said we're taking it from the consumer world. I'll never forget when you told me at your previous job that you were on one floor trying to innovate healthcare and Google was below you, and you were competing for the same professionals to do this type of machine learning. So I think you've had this front and center experience with this, right?
Absolutely, yeah, it is right. I mean, it's interesting. I think, if the question is why now, what's changed, the answer is pretty simple in my mind. I agree with all of the things that were discussed in terms of technology. It is technology as time has come. it is, now is the right time. You've got the likes of Google, to your point, that are doing this. So why not us in healthcare? I think the answer is pretty simple, and I'm talking about this from the perspective of a clinician, but also as an innovator, as a strategist. The answer really is cognitive burden. I mean, if you just look at the signal to noise ratio that's out there, we have so much data. We are swimming in data. We're drowning in data. Yet the signal to noise ratio isn't what it needs to be. As a radiologist, I can tell you this. The old adage has been "run for the hills." The machines are coming, right? We're going to get replaced as a community of radiologists by these algorithms, and I think there's some truth to it in the sense that not only are they coming, they're already here. But having said that, I think the biggest driver of why now really is cognitive burden. There's just so much data that we're surrounded with. I mean, as a clinician, I see this all the time amongst my peers as well, is, they're always going from window to window, trying to play detective, trying to piece information together, just to a point where you have just enough data or just enough insights or just enough information. And I don't think that's good enough. I think just enough healthcare isn't good enough healthcare. What we need really is to be able to decipher the signal to noise ratio, be able to digest all of the data that exists out there, be what I call hyper aware. And AI and machine learning, deep learning, these are capabilities that we now have greater access to in ways that we've not had before, that in many ways would allow for us to address that cognitive burden and get to the right balance of the signal to noise ratio, so that we're then able to prioritize, and we're able to not play the role of that detective that we've been playing for a long time now, as we've been dealing with all of that data that's hitting us, but really play that role of the clinician that we went to med school for, that we became physicians and clinicians for, so that we can empathize, we can connect at a very human and a very personal level, and let the algorithms do their stuff. Let it augment essentially the care that we're providing to them. And I think that is the biggest why that I see out there is that cognitive burden.
Excellent.
Hey, John, if I could add to that, I think that Rasu's comment about the radiologist is really compelling, because I was at a consortium a year ago, and the radiologist in the room said, "Listen, I'm like a professional baseball pitcher. I can call balls and strikes in 0.3 of a second. So when I see an image, I know right away if it's a tumor and what stage it is. But where I see AI and machine learning really augmenting and enhancing is that if you've got a workload of 25 patients and you have 3 of them that are really late stage cancer patients, you'd really like to get to those caseloads first versus the ones that are benign or the negatives, right? And so if we could see that signal in the noise, and the machine can kind of help truncate the time to value, then absolutely we can get scale and we can do more with less. And to Russ's point, we can, as a clinician, spend more time bedside, being the analyst instead of the detective.
I like that, Ed. And I think it's interesting because I think this discussion is about augmenting the clinician. And we've described 2. One is Rasu had talked about, okay, how do we diagnose, and can we replace the diagnosis of a radiologist, or I guess they don't technically diagnose, huh, Rasu, but the read of the radiologist. But that's one. And then Ed brings up a different side, which is how do we use AI to prioritize the work that's being done by the clinicians? So I think that's another impressive way to augment a clinician. The one that I was most excited to see at HIMSS, and kind of unfortunate that we don't get to see it in all its glory, is ambient clinical voice. And the ability for voice to take the cognitive load that Rasu talked about and be able to, document the patient visit in the EHR to meet the meaningful use, I guess now promoting interoperability measures and all of the requirements for reimbursement and doing it. What other ones are you seeing? Corinne, maybe you want to chime in. What other places are we seeing augmentation that are really exciting?
Sure. Actually, this past summer, I did go to an appointment with a pediatric ophthalmologist, which had a scribe. And it was a person, but I immediately saw the benefit that it allowed for a lot more of that personal interaction with the clinician. And it was a medical student who was learning a ton about billing and coding in the background, but also learning about where to sort of capture onto key topics in the discussion. And so there's a technique here that's in use in natural language processing. It's called named entity recognition. And this is used a lot when you're sort of combing through notes. And what I like about this technique and what we're learning from it is that it does what Ed said. It helps you to pull something meaningful out of a large set or a large cohort of data. Instead of spending time doing a manual chart review looking for very key events, it should be able to bubble to the top what you need to put top of mind, either entering a visit or exiting a visit. And I would love to see more clear use cases of where we're gaining value from named entity recognition and some of these more natural language technologies, because these can go look back even further than when we've had meaningful use and alignment to some of our standard nomenclatures. I think too, it helps to ease some of the conversations, because instead of structuring them solely on what you need to document for MIPS and MACRA, you have more of that personal interaction, and later the paperwork almost takes care of itself. I love this topic of reducing the clinical burden, because that is, very frankly, what brought me into this field. I came in as an allied health professional, as a technologist at UPMC, because I wanted to help the clinical staff without myself being a clinician. And now I feel like I'm able to better do that at scale through the technologies, like some of this natural language processing, like some of this signal extraction. And I know internal to my organization, we've been spending a lot more time on the concept of entropy, of if there are signals that show up over and over again, the more frequently they appear, the less signal they tend to carry. And so the corollary that we see in the Seattle area is, if you tell me it's going to rain tomorrow, that doesn't mean much to me because it's more likely to rain anyway. So there's a lot of entropy, a lot of noise in that message. But if you tell me tomorrow it's likely to snow, all of a sudden I take notice. And that's where I think some of the technologies are helping us, is they're sort of filtering out some of that rote paper trail, but then they're saying, you know, we're talking about this particular diagnosis for this person. When I look over records for this patient and similar patients, here are the things that start to jump out at me. And here are the things that you as a clinician were likely to go seeking, only instead of you doing it, you're having your system do that in advance for you, and you're sort of curating the results.
That's great. Interesting, it rained in Vegas, so we would have had the opposite signal problem of you, which was the opposite. Right. Although what you said something. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I'm sure someone tweeted this. The paperwork takes care of itself. Now that's a vision, and it feels like it's almost there. You know, the technologies are nearly there. Any others you'd add, Rasu or Ed?
Well, I was going to piggyback on. Go ahead, Rasu. All right, I was going to piggyback on the fact that we certainly have heard that medical errors are costly, and Johns Hopkins had a study in 2016 that I read that it's the third leading cause of death behind heart disease and cancer. And the economic value of that, which I'm not able to correlate in any study that I could find, but going back to 2008, medical errors were equate to $1 trillion of economic impact. And so when you think about the fact that we have the ability now to create some color with natural language processing, we can kind of get to the emotion behind the words, right? So if something's really going to rain tomorrow, or, you know, we expect rain, you know, that little inflection is hard to interpret in a very binary way. And now I think, to Corinne's point, we've got the ability to do a better job of interpreting the words that are being captured, and that will, I think, improve coding, and I think that will reduce the number of errors due to things being miscoded and things being misdiagnosed.
I agree with that. You know, what else I'd add there, you know, we talked about cognitive burden, you know, the signal to noise ratio, and we're talking about a number of other things related to, you know, why we should use more AI. I think it is about also fighting burnout. You know, today we're being inundated with all these tasks that we need to do as clinicians. You know, the EMR has become, as we all have acknowledged in our individual conversations and the work that we do, it's become a billing and a documentation system, and it's a legal record more than it is a collaborative tool that is focused really on that patient or on that person. So for us, there are all these tasks that we need to do, and so I think a core goal of ours should really be to make sure that we're able to leverage these capabilities to help us become better clinicians, help us really fight the burnout that we're facing on a day in, day out basis. You know, I talk a lot about artificial intelligence, but what we're oftentimes doing as we're leveraging AI in our everyday clinical work is we're trying to take the artificialness out of the work that we're doing, right? We don't want technology to artificially get in the way between the human interactions that we need to have between clinicians, or between the patient and the clinician, or the circle of trust around that patient and us as clinical partners. So in many ways, you know, what we're trying to do really is to you know, reduce burnout or fight burnout, leveraging even AI. And there are lots of tools and capabilities that are coming out there. Just to give you a quick example, when I was at UPMC, was involved in creating what we had called Empower MD with Microsoft, leveraging their AI stack. Microsoft's now gone out to market with Nuance with this product, and then essentially it's really around conversational documentation. And the idea there is with our permission, there would be a machine that would be in the room listening in on our conversation between the doctor or the clinician and the patient. And as we would finish up on that encounter or on that conversation, a good chunk of the conversation would already be recorded and transcribed into a clinical note. A good 50, 70, perhaps even 90% of the note would be complete by the time we would have had that encounter before we even enter into anything into the EMR. So that's one example, and there are multiple other examples of how AI could really help reduce burden, could really help this notion of all the tasks that we need to do, but making sure that we're then able to bring emphasis back onto the more human elements of what we set out to do in the first place.
Awesome. Thanks, Rasu. And for everyone watching live, if you have any questions, feel free to insert them into the question box, and we're happy to ask our panelists those questions and try to incorporate them into the conversation. I think what you said is really interesting, though, because it is a bit of a double-edged sword when it comes to patients. Because as a patient, I love, and Corinne even highlighted it when she went to the doctor, she loved that the doctor was more interested in her. They were using a scribe, but you could imagine a virtual scribe at some point doing the same sort of impact, so that the doctor was giving her more attention as a patient, which was a valuable thing. But I think there's also the fear, as many patients, is, wait, all the tech is listening to me? And, like, do I want the tech in the room? And, like, what does that mean for my privacy? So, what are the gives and takes of some of this technology on the patients? Corinne, maybe you want to start and then go to Ed?
Yes, this is actually an area that I'm extremely passionate about, which is algorithmic accountability. It turns out that there's actually some draft legislation that came out last spring on this topic, and we're already now in what I'm calling the second wave of algorithmic accountability, which is don't just wait and react to legislation, but get ahead of it. We need to constantly be cognizant of the types of pitfalls that, like I said, when I was, extolling the virtues of machine learning in the consumer space, we've also seen significant missteps in the consumer space, and we need to be internalizing those lessons in the healthcare space as well. So we talk about FATE in machine learning: fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. And these are all topics that need to go into your design and your relationship with patients and their caregivers. So I think about in the scenario that I spoke about, I wasn't the patient, I was the caregiver. It was my newborn daughter who was the patient. And this concept that if I were to replace that personal scribe with a digital scribe, I would want to know, what is it listening to, what is it doing, and what is the benefit to me as well. And those are all things that are tangible outcomes of algorithmic accountability. They are a commitment from industry that we will continuously design for monitoring, design for traceability, and for transparency, that we can always share our results and ensure that we are doing what is best in the interest of privacy. I think that, you know, when we look back at HIPAA, I do my HIPAA recertification every year, and then I think about the amount of data that I'm giving away in the consumer space. I see that there's definitely a dissonance in what I'm willing to give up on one front, but also on what has already been sort of mandated around me and hasn't yet come into alignment with the consumer space. I think that these are all coming to a head in the next year or two, and I expect to see future legislation, but also potential changes to HIPAA that takes this concept of algorithmic and machine learning accountability into play. That just like when I download an app and it says I am giving it permission to use my camera, use my microphone, use my this, I would expect that if there is something in the room, or if there is something that is combing my record, that I see an accounting of how my data is going to be used, and that I can either approve or reject certain use cases.
Some challenging stuff there for sure. I mean, I know in previous meetups with Dell Technologies, we've talked about even how the data is biased because we only collected certain data, right? And so that can influence the impact downstream as well. Ed, any further thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I do remember as a part of some of the big data workshops that we had, we talked about creepy versus cool. And if you think about, there was a case in New York, I believe, where there was a customer of a retailer that was getting advertisement for, you know, basically newborn products, and they were, you know, not of age to be having a child, and they were irritated that they kept getting these advertisements to sell them, you know, things that an expecting mother would be in need of. But the data scientists had been able to predict within a week of the labor date when, you know, somebody would be expecting. And so obviously they were tailoring their marketing approach, the target marketing, to, you know, what trimester that customer was in. And it turns out in this case it was the teenage daughter that was expecting, and you know, basically the retailer knew it, but the parents did not. So kind of creepy. But, you know, it's certainly cool if, as you come into to check in, to be admitted to a hospital, and they are able to facially recognize, be able to listen to your voice, and be able to understand, understand by who might be with you and advocating for your care, what role, like Corinne is playing in this case, maybe the mother, versus, you know, and being kind of a care advocate as opposed to actually being the incoming patient. And so that would be cool. So things that can kind of improve the patient's experience, certainly I think will have to be legislated, and kind of the spectrum will have to be balanced over time. But I think it's kind of also interesting that the generational impact of this plays a role. I think older generations, I can speak for my parents, are very adverse to any sort of listening, but, you know, they do not want anybody understanding what they're doing. They don't even want their kids knowing what's going on with their health, right? But you could, like, my kids have no problem sharing anything and everything as long as they have access to an optimal experience. So their permissions on surveillance, if you will, and monitoring is much more expansive than, you know, my parents. So I think it's going to be an interesting journey over the next 10 years as healthcare actually will probably kind of set the new bar and standard for what, you know, kind of that accountability should look like.
Yeah, and I've often said that it's interesting how something that was creepy becomes normal and eventually becomes accepted. or expected. And so like there's this interesting arc that we go through in our lives where at first we're scared, then we're like, oh yeah, that just happens. And then you're like, wait, you don't do that? And so it's interesting how it evolves. And I think within populations that changes. Rasu, it looked like you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. This brings up a whole series of conversations, series of things that we need to be really focusing in on. So as we look forward at 2020 and the decade ahead, I think now is the right time for us to ask these hard questions in terms of not just how do we embrace AI into our clinical workflows and our daily lives, and even up to the consumer, but what are some of these hard questions that we need to be asking ourselves, right? So as Ed and Corinne rightly said, ethics around AI is real. I mean, there are lots of ethical questions that we need to be asking of ourselves. You brought up bias, right? And there's some level of bias in every decision making that we make, even as human beings, let alone algorithms. The question becomes, much like the trolley example, if you've read that in terms of machine learning when you're training AI. Similarly for humans, right? Well, there's some level of bias that you'd expect when you go in and see a clinician, and you choose to go see that expert clinician, in part perhaps because of his or her biases, But if an algorithm is biased to a point where perhaps the decision was the wrong one, the question then becomes, who do you sue, right? I mean, do you sue the the coder? Do you sue the health system? Do you sue the clinician who maybe used AI to augment the care that they were providing? Do you sue whoever has the deepest pockets, which probably is the answer? But biases, these are questions that we need to really ask. I think there are questions around liability, obviously security and privacy. And then there are lots of other elements that we need to think about, equity and equality when it comes to these algorithms and the insights that they're generating. So lots of difficult questions that I think now is the right time for us to ask those questions. And I agree with your notion, John, that over time we become more comfortable with these capabilities that are suddenly introduced in front of us. But I think we shouldn't confuse complacency with comfort, right? I don't think now is the time to be complacent. I think now is the time to ask these hard questions so that we can address those head on, so that when we start addressing them, then for the right reasons, we can start being more comfortable with them.
I actually want to jump in.
Go ahead, Corinne.
I think to draw parallels to my favorite consumer technologies, I love this feature that we demanded of the advertising world. Why am I seeing this? That to me is one of the best features that I've seen pushed out of a lot of the technologies that we're discussing today. And that was because people were demanding accountability. To speak to the anecdote that Ed shared, why am I getting targeted advertisement for new mother baby care? We don't know that all the time today, and especially in healthcare, because we don't feel in the loop. But that's the accountability that I think we should start to demand and expect, to keep that creepy factor from being too creepy, and also to prevent that complacency. Because by demanding this sort of transparency, we then are holding these providers of these technologies accountable for explaining themselves and the reasons why something may occur. That's the best way to detect some of these errors, is to say, oh, it's suggesting that for me because, but I know that's wrong. So let's fix that.
That's great, Corinne. And actually, we got the question about the liability, Rasu, so I'm glad you addressed it. They said, what about liability in relation to AI? And I would even expand the question to say, how do we do it without, while avoiding the liability risk? Or, how do we minimize that risk? Otherwise, we're not going to be able to see these technologies. Any thoughts, Ed, on things you've seen, or how people are?
This has come up a lot because, as Rasu commented on earlier, the EHR, EMR systems have really become, for all intents and purposes, a glorified billing system, right? It's to be able to account for the services provided so that you can get reimbursed. It's not really to capture what's salient with the person that you're providing care to. And that's why there's been things like Salesforce.com that have entered, in kind of from a patient CRM perspective to try to capture some of that, right? But at the end of the day, if we're looking at how we can impact care, and we want to do so in a way that's going to be helpful, I think that we're kind of in a state where we can't continue to do things the way we've done it.
Yep. So we only have about 7 minutes left. So there's a couple of topics, so hopefully we can get to. One that I think would be interesting is, what are we not doing today that's possible that you wish they would apply some machine learning and AI to? Rasu, you want to take it? You like hard questions, you said.
Yeah, no, there's just a lot of things that we're not doing today. I think one of the things, just to go after a big one, is I would love for us to leverage more of these capabilities to empower our patients. And today, there's such an afterthought in whether it's the design of the solutions, or even in them getting access to what rightfully is their own data. And yesterday we saw the ONC Cures Act, the final rule come out, and lots of great conversations around it. I was actually reading through as much of the 1,244 pages as I absolutely could, and I was trying to pull out pertinent things that I could read from it, including all of the comments as well. I was also doing some this searching on the PDF file. While there were almost 600 mentions of interoperability and 1,000 mentions of blocking, there were, happily so, 1,331 mentions of API and 1,357 mention of patient, which is awesome, right? So a lot of mentions of patient.
Yeah, that's great.
But yeah, which is good. So how do we make sure that with these newer rulings that now would perhaps spur innovation, that would allow for us to really look at different ways to enable patients access to their own health information, and obviously stop data blocking from being a thing? How do we make sure that we're really empowering the patient, right? Because it's not just about us giving them a blob of data and say, hey, here's data that is now finally, hooray, in a machine readable format. How do we get it to them in a human readable format, right? How do we make sure that that nudges behavior in the right way, that it empowers them to have the right conversations with their loved ones, with their physicians, with their clinicians, with whoever it is that they need to be interacting with, so that they are finally empowered. So I think that's something that we're actually not doing today that we should be doing in troves.
So I wanted to clarify. I lost my train of thought on that. So when we were talking about kind of the legality, issue, I think that because doctors on that arc have been concerned that if something is identified and it's not in the EMR or EHR, the system of record, so to speak, that there would be some sort of additional liability posed to them for not acting or not following or modifying a protocol. And what I think the counterpoint to that, and something that I think is borne out as we've become more able to capitalize on some of these insights, is the insight was always there. It just wasn't provided at the point of care. And so when we've done postmortem and we've looked at, like, we chose protocol A, might have we chosen protocol B or C, in the event that we actually had access to some of these insights provided by AI and machine learning, we actually can then draw from that and call into expert testimony to say, hey, this is why we made the decision that we did. We actually have some evidence-based insights here that support what we did. And so the question becomes, is it incumbent upon that to reside inside the EMR, EHR system, or does it need to just be institutionalized in a way that it can get to the clinicians at the point of care? And I think that's something that we have to kind of figure out. But I think that to kind of follow on what Rasu was talking about in terms of what is it that we're not doing, I think that adding on this topic around interoperability, today we know if we go to the store and we have a transaction, we pull out an ATM card or a credit card, and instantaneously that financial transaction happens. But when we're sitting with our physician and we're being prescribed a care plan, and that's going to require some medication. It's not a transaction in terms of, are you pre-approved for the recommended medications? Are these medications the ones that are the most, that have the highest degree of efficacy given your set of conditions? Is this like offered by the pharmacy that's proximal and ideal given the way you shop and live? And what's the cost of that drug relative to other options, right? So it would be great that we are really providing real-time clinical decision support. And I think Rasu kind of mentioned, alluded to, there's this Project Da Vinci where we've got this opportunity to get ahead of a federal mandate to really truncate the time to answer between the payer and the provider. And I think as we look over the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be incumbent that the patient is going to be empowered with those answers and is going to be expecting the physician to have those same answers, and for that to be a credit card, type of real-time transaction, as opposed to kind of the latency that's involved in the way we manage our care today.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's interesting for me, it's a lot about managing expectations. As Rasu said, we can give them a data dump, but that's not the expectation of the patient. If you give them a data dump, they'll say, what is this? And they probably distrust you. It actually hurts your trust because they're like, this is the type of stuff you're documenting for me, so we need to make it more actionable. I love the idea of empowering patients. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, so maybe we'll give the last few moments to Ed to kind of wrap it up as our host from Dell Technologies. And, Ed, you want to take us home and wrap this up?
Yeah, appreciate the colleagues on the panel here sharing time to talk a little bit about AI and machine learning in healthcare. Certainly look forward to engaging all of you that are on the call that have questions like these, that would like to kind of understand what can be done. Dell Technologies is certainly, as a healthcare a vertical within our organization, cares very much about what we can do to improve patient care and outcomes, and look forward to working with you as we go forward. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks everyone for joining live, and to all of our panelists. Should we give a virtual, do we do a virtual elbow bump? I don't know.
Yeah. There we go.
Thanks everyone for joining. We'll be publishing the recorded version of this as well, and sending that out to any of you that want to go back and review, or maybe only were able to attend part of it. So watch for that in your email inbox. And a big thank you to Dell Technologies and to Corinne Stroum and Rasu Shrestha and Ed Shaffer. So thanks everyone. Have a great day.